Welcome to the Fantasy's Finest Fantasy Football Podcast. Here are your hosts, William Spencer, Jalen McQueen, and Mark Carter.
What's going on? Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Fantasy's Finest Podcast. I'm your host, William Spencer, and today we got a lot to cover as we get you guys ready for another week of waivers. So you got to have some options to target, and what better way to get you guys prepared than a good episode on waivers. So we're going to cover that in this episode. We also got our Victory Tuesday. If you made it through this point after 3 weeks, you're sitting at 2-1 or maybe 3-0. You're sitting kind of pretty right now. And if you're at 1-2 or maybe 0-3, don't panic just yet. There's still plenty of moves that you can make. So don't freak out. You still got options, and hopefully you'll be able to follow along with us, and we'll get you straight on what you need to do to be able to help your fantasy teams. And also in Victory Tuesday, we got to highlight one of the best performers in week 3. I know I haven't been able to do that on the show before, but that's a mistake that I want to rectify today and highlight one of the best performers in week 3. We also got another segment that we like to use called Gimme 5. And in this particular segment, we'll be highlighting 5 players that you probably need to drop from your fantasy lineups and your fantasy teams right now, because they just haven't been able to perform up until this point, and holding on to them. You can make the choice to hold on to them, but I'm going to give you the names of the guys that you should drop from your fantasy teams. So we got a lot to cover in this episode, but before we do, make sure that you're following the podcast on our YouTube channel at Fantasy's Finest. You can also follow the audios on your favorite podcast platforms like Apple and Spotify. Follow us there too and hit the subscribe buttons at Fantasy's Finest on those as well. You can also follow us across your social medias like Twitter and TikTok at Fantasy's Finest there too. And if you want to follow me, my handle is hype_finest on Twitter. You can follow me over there because I'm not calling it X. It's never going to be X for me. All right. Now that we've got the pleasantries out of the way, let's talk about that guy, that performer that helped fantasy managers out in week 3, and he was coming off the waiver wire. I'm talking about Jauan Jennings from the San Francisco 49ers, 175 yards, 3 touchdowns, 46.5 fantasy points. If you manage to grab him off waivers, because, hey, right here, I was the guy to tell you, grab Jauan Jennings because Deebo Samuels is hurt. And then George Kittle went down with a hamstring injury. He was going to be one of the guys that was going to get that work because there basically was nobody left but Brandon Ayuk out there. So if you grab Jauan Jennings and you were bold enough to play him, you should be sitting pretty this week. So I just wanted to highlight Jauan Jennings. He's had a fantasy week. He was the wide receiver 1 for week 3. Fantastic performance, and he's probably set you right heading into week 4. Now we got a bunch of news that we need to cover, so let's get right into it with our news and notes from around the NFL.
News and notes from around the NFL.
All right, like I said, we got a bunch of news that we need to get through and a lot of information to make you make decisions or help you make decisions on your fantasy lineups or give you some ways to be able to prepare for week 4. So first up, Adam Thielen. He suffered a hamstring injury in week 3 versus the Raiders. He will be placed on IR. He is going to be out and he will miss the next 4 games. So if you had Adam Thielen and you picked him up off of waivers, you might as well just throw him back down there or put him in the IR slot because he's not going to be available. Cardinals tight end Trey McBride suffered a concussion. He has entered the league's concussion protocol. Make sure to monitor his status heading into week 4 so you know whether or not you'll be able to play him if he can get out of the concussion protocol. Sean McVay, he says that Cooper Kupp will not play in week 4. Kupp is still dealing with an ankle injury. They didn't opt to put Kupp on injury reserve. They were hoping to get him back sooner, I'm guessing. But now it looks like he could possibly return in week 5. And if not, they could opt to keep Cup out for a little bit longer because they do have a week 6 bye, which would afford him another week of additional rest. So we may not see Cooper Kupp or Puka Nacua after week 6 or their week 6 bye. Jordan Love, he's expected to be practicing this week on a limited basis heading into week 4. There's speculation that he has a real chance to be able to play in week 4 against the Minnesota Vikings. I'm going to say they're going to err on the side of caution and kind of keep him out, at least give him another week to recover. Remember, he suffered a knee injury in week 1 against the Philadelphia Eagles, so it would be more prudent to help him to recover a little bit longer, allow him to get that rest so they can get him for the rest of the season. And to be honest, Malik Willis is playing pretty well. He's keeping the Packers afloat. They've won a couple of games with him, so they shouldn't be in a rush to bring back Jordan Love. So that might be a positive that works in their favor. But that's it for the news. Now let's get into these waiver wire. I always get tongue-tied on that. Waiver wire options for week 4. Okay, so not only do we have waiver wire options in the podcast episode, but if you go to the fantasyfinance.com and check out the website, we also have an article up with some more options there for you for the waivers heading into week 4. So you might want to check that out too. Compare some notes to what you hear as opposed to what you're going to read over there. And maybe you might find an option or two to be able to help add to your fantasy rosters. But first, I'm going to give you Xavier Legette from the Carolina Panthers. He's only rostered in 20% of ESPN fantasy leagues. I think this is a perfect opportunity with Adam Thielen on IR for Legette to be able to get more snaps and to be able to step into that wide receiver 2 role. I know that Jonathan Mingo is there, but I'm willing to take the chance on Legette being that wide receiver 2 option for Carolina, for Andy Dalton. We saw how Andy Dalton was moving in that game against the Las Vegas Raiders. I got to be honest, he looked fantastic. To be able to hit Deontay Johnson and provide all that extra targets that we haven't seen from the Panthers with Bryce Young. Unfortunately, it's Dalton's job to lose now. And as long as Dalton is in charge and he's the QB, the rest of the skilled players should see added boost to their value. So if you can grab Legette and add him to your rosters, I think that would be the move to make. There is some similarities in terms of targets with Legette and Mingo, but I wouldn't concern myself with that too much. I think this is a point where we get to see whether or not Jonathan Mingo or Xavier Legette can separate themselves and become that wide receiver 2 option behind Deontay Johnson. Another player that I'm looking for fantasy managers to add this week is Bucky Irving, only rostered in 33% of ESPN leagues. He's expected to get an increase in snaps. Right now, he's only floating around 33%, opposed to Rachaad White 72%. But the thing that is getting Bucky Irving more attention and more looks is the fact that he's been more efficient as opposed to Rachaad White with his carries and snaps, in contrast to White. In terms of rushing, Bucky Irving is averaging almost 8 yards a carry. 8 yards a carry up to Rachaad White's 2.1. So they're trying to get Bucky Irving more involved in the offense. We could be seeing a potential 50-50 split coming up much sooner than later. If not, Bucky Irving taking over overall the workload from Rachaad White, because whatever is going on with him, he hasn't been able to get it done for fantasy over the first 3 weeks of the season. They need a run game in Tampa Bay to be able to help Baker Mayfield out. And I think this is the trend. We're going to keep seeing Bucky Irving being talked about more and more as we go into the season. And he's going to get more and more work. So if that's the case and Todd Bowles is a man of his word, Bucky Irving should be on the rise, and you might want to get a piece of that. Now, going back to the wide receiver position, Mike Wilson from the Arizona Cardinals, the number 2 wide receiver. He's rostered in just 12% of ESPN leagues. He finished second in targets in week 3, behind Marvin Harrison Jr., of course. But he had an 88% catch rate in that game. He saw targets as a deep threat as well as in an intermediate range. Mike Wilson is one of my favorite sleepers heading into the season. There's going to be enough volume to be able to involve Marvin Harrison Jr. and Mike Wilson. And with the news that Trey McBride is in the NFL concussion protocol, this might be an opportunity for Mike Wilson to be able to further separate himself as one of those main targets for Kyler Murray in that Arizona Cardinals offense. If you can grab him, if you got the space, I know earlier in the season I had to make a choice between Mike Wilson and Darnell Mooney, and I wanted to keep both for myself, but it wasn't able to happen that way. So if you can get Mike Wilson and stash him on your bench, or he might make a good flex option for your fantasy team, depending on what you have, I would definitely do that. Another wide receiver who I've been telling you guys about all offseason to ignore the noise, to ignore the reports, because remember, he was supposed to be a wide receiver 4 on the depth chart, right? Quentin Johnston, Los Angeles Chargers wide receiver, rostered under 50%, 43% on ESPN leagues. He had 44 yards and a touchdown against the Pittsburgh Steelers, 100% catch rate. And before, I'm not trying to gas that up because it was only on 2 targets because Justin Herbert ended up getting hurt in that game. Remember, he's still dealing with a high ankle injury that was reported earlier before the game started. There was even speculation that he wasn't going to play, but he manned up and he tried to give it his best effort. He got rolled up, so they want to make sure that he's okay. But Quentin Johnston, he's still the man. He's still the wide receiver that we've been hoping to get outside of his first year as a rookie and being underused. He's second on the team in targets for over the last 3 weeks. He's just behind Ladd McConkey, but he's first in fantasy points among the Chargers wide receivers. Ladd McConkey is coming in second at 26.9. Quentin Johnston, 43 fantasy points on the season so far. That's a good look for a guy who was supposed to be a wide receiver 4 or might not have made the cut. You wouldn't believe the things that were being said about Quentin Johnston this offseason, but that was one of my ride or die guys, and he is performing well so far. I would like to see him a little bit more volume in terms of passing, but the hardball boy and Greg Roman like to run the ball, and it's been beneficial for J.K. Dobbins, who was a late round running back grab. It's working so far. They haven't had the need to pass the ball a little bit more, but Quentin Johnston is still the wide receiver to own over there in Los Angeles. And finally, Tutu Atwell. Now, let me just say this. The wide receiver position behind Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua is basically in shambles. We've tried to figure out where the ball was going to go with those 2 wide receivers out. You know, we talked about DeMarcus Robinson. We talked about Tyler Johnson. I mean, I'm going to be honest. Tutu Atwell, at this point, you're probably just grasping at straws. But if you desperately need a wide receiver or another option to get you fantasy points, maybe Tutu Atwell works out. He's rostered in just 2% of ESPN leagues. He finished with 5 targets against San Fran in week 3. No other wide receiver had more than 5 targets outside of Tutu Atwell. He did finish the game with 93 yards. So maybe there's some PPR aspect that you can play with as far as Tutu Atwell. It's kind of a dart throw at this point. We don't really know how the Rams wide receivers are going to look, how much volume they're going to get. Maybe there's some trust with Matthew Stafford and Tutu Atwell that will be able to help pay off in fantasy dividends, but I'm going to be honest, it's probably a dart throw. If you can avoid grabbing Tutu Atwell, you probably should, but I got to give you options and let you make the decision for your fantasy rosters. So I'm giving them to you. Tutu Atwell, he's on the list this week. He's on the list this week. But that'll be it for this section, this segment. We got the waivers out of the way, so let's close it out with the Gimme 5. I'm going to give you guys 5 players that you probably should think about dropping from your fantasy teams.
Gimme 5.
All right. Now, this part, it hurts to have to say this, but for my first drop, man, Ezekiel Elliott, it might be time to call it quits for. And believe me, I don't want to go this route. I was champion Ezekiel Elliott this whole offseason. I was glad that he was back. I didn't like how the Cowboys made this move because it just felt like, oh, this is our last move. We don't have to worry about it. It was kind of like it was in our back pocket. It was in their back pocket, the front office, bringing in Ezekiel Elliott because they didn't grab a running back during the draft. They didn't grab one during free agency, and I can get into all of that. But right now, Ezekiel Elliott just hasn't been able to perform up to where we need him to keep him on our fantasy rosters. He was supposed to be the running back one for the Cowboys, but we've seen his carries drop over the last 2 games. He barely got in the game against the Ravens. He was hardly used. Only 1 touchdown on the season, and that was back in week 1 against the Cleveland Browns. He just hasn't been performing where we need him to be, even as a potential flex option. So for that reason, I mean, I'll put it like this. If you want to give him 1 more week because they do play the Giants on Thursday night, that might be the last straw. If we don't see anything out of the Cowboys run game, and we don't see Ezekiel Elliott being used or getting that extra work, because let's be honest, Rico Dowdle, to me, is not the answer either. Maybe they should bring in Dalvin Cook. That's a whole nother monster that we could talk about. But right now, Ezekiel Elliott, if you can afford to drop him, you probably should. Hurts my soul. But another guy you should probably consider dropping is Adonai Mitchell from the Indianapolis Colts. 10 targets over the first 3 games, just 2 receptions. Him, Mitchell, and Anthony Richardson just haven't been able to connect. You have Michael Pittman, who's going to see a large target share because he's the wide receiver 1. Alec Pierce has been seeing a lot of work. That seems to be Anthony Richardson, one of his favorite guys to target. And matter of fact, he came in 1 game with an Alec Pierce shirt. So if there's anything to tell you that that's where he wants to go with the ball, because that's his guy, he's going to try and get him the ball. Alec Pierce is actually second on the team in targets, but he leads all Colts wide receivers in receiving yards at 225. Remember, he had that big game earlier in the season. He had over 120 yards that game. Just a ridiculous output. But he's not qualified. He is the Colts' deep threat. So look for Anthony Richardson to look to him more often than not. Adonai Mitchell just hasn't been able to produce yet. If you want to stash him and hold on and hope that turns around later on in the season, that's an option. But for me, if I have any shares of Adonai Mitchell, he's going to the waiver wire. I'm going to try and grab another option that could actually put up fantasy points and be productive because I can't hold that dead weight. And speaking of dead weight, Zamir White from the Los Angeles Raiders. Come on down, sir. You have not performed the way that we wanted you to, or we hoped for this offseason. We thought that you were going to be the guy who was going to lead the Raiders backfield. We thought that you were going to be the main man to get all the carries after Josh Jacobs went to the Green Bay Packers during the free agency period. He did not come back, but the Raiders, for whatever reason, don't want to run the ball. They don't want to run the ball with Zamir White. He's currently the running back 49 heading into week 4. He's averaging 3.2 yards per attempt, and he's giving up work to Alexander Madison. Madison scored a touchdown in week 3. They don't use Zamir White in the red zone, so he can't even be a touchdown dependent running back for you. So what recourse do you have to keep Zamir White? He is the starter. He's supposed to be the starter. He's supposed to be getting those running back 1 carries. But with the way that the Raiders have been trying to run the ball, it just doesn't seem to be working. And they're opting more to add Alexander Madison to the mix, what we didn't think was going to happen after the year he had in his final year with the Minnesota Vikings. But apparently they love some Alexander Madison, or they like getting him involved in the offense, and it's hurting Zamir White. So he's got to hit the bricks too. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about a quarterback that you should probably looking to get off of your fantasy teams. And that's Trevor Lawrence. You know what, to put it simply, Trevor Lawrence, you stink, man. I'm not even trying to be smart. Currently the QB 26 heading into week 4, 11.3 fantasy points per game. I need Trevor Lawrence to lock in. You got that big contract. You got weapons. You just for whatever reason, you can't hit those weapons or be consistent in the passing game. Just 53% completion percentage heading into week 4. He's averaging 186 yards per game right now. You have great weapons, at least in my opinion. You got Gabe Davis. You got the rookie Brian Thomas Jr., who should be seeing more targets than he has. Now, he did get a nice target share, but that was because, they were getting smoked by the Bills. They were behind the whole game. They had to throw. And even then, he still couldn't pass for over 200 yards. That's not great. So, Trevor Lawrence, unfortunately, until you can produce and be more than the 11.3 fantasy point average that you're putting out right now, I can't keep you on my team. Matter of fact, if I'm being honest, I dropped him in week 2. I couldn't take the chance. Derek Carr was there. Sam Darnold's there. Oh, I don't even talk about him. But he's an option. These are options that you could use to help your fantasy team. Shoot, Deshaun Watson is averaging more fantasy points than Trevor Lawrence right now. So I got to switch gears and grab another quarterback. Aaron Rodgers is putting up more fantasy points than Trevor Lawrence right now. He's 40. So I got to switch gears and go somewhere else. Hopefully you didn't get tied down with Trevor Lawrence either. You were able to pivot out before it was too late. And our final drop, Jaylen Warren. Now, Jaylen Warren, I think the expectation was for him to be working in tandem with Najee Harris to be able to give you that 1-2 punch the Steelers like using both of those running backs. Unfortunately, he hasn't been able to live up to that tandem. He's injured right now. He's dealing with a knee injury. He's considered week to week as it is. But even before the injury, he's only averaging 3.9 yards per attempt, 4.4 fantasy points per game. It's a guy that you can't even put in your lineups and trust to get you fantasy points because he's just not producing. In a system that likes to run the ball. 54 yards on the season. And again, he's the secondary option behind Najee Harris. So he's not giving you anything. So if he's not giving you anything and you're holding a roster spot or you're holding a bench spot for a guy who's collecting dust on your fantasy roster, because you can't even trust him to put him in your starting lineup, even as a flex. So you can't put him in there and trust him. Why are you keeping him on your roster? But that's it. Those are my guys for the drops. I gave you my guys for the waivers. We shouted out the best performer in week 3. The show is done. That's it. So, like I said in the outset, make sure that you're following the Fantasy's Finest on our YouTube channel at Fantasy's Finest. Check us out and hit that subscribe button. Hit the like button. Leave some comments. I like the engagement to be able to talk to you guys. And, of course, check out thefantasysfinest.com for our latest articles. And head over to our social medias on Twitter and TikTok and check us out there. And make sure that you are locked in with us on our audio platforms like Apple and Spotify. But that's it for the episode. I will check you guys in our next one. Until then, take it easy. I hope you guys win your next week. Week 4, let's lock in.
Thanks for listening to the Fantasy's Finest podcast. Be sure to join the community on Facebook and follow us on Twitter too at the Fantasy's Finest. See you next episode.